Hey everybody, Amy here. I want to tell you about a book, give you a little book report on one of these many books that I own. A book that I've read and that I loved, and a book that I want you to read because I like you, and I think that you will love it too. But here's the thing. When I tell you this book that I want you to read, you are not going to believe me. You are going to be very skeptical. So let me back up a little bit first. I ask myself sometimes, why do I keep all these books around? Because it is kind of a hassle, just keeping track of all of them, keeping them organized. Moving is a nightmare with all these books. But I realize, I keep these books around for the same reason that I keep scissors around, and packing tape, and box cutters, and WD-40. I keep them around because they're useful, because I need them. They're tools that I use to shape my mind in a certain direction when I want to do so. And one of the most common reasons that I need a book, and I think this is true for most people with books, is as an escape, as a way of disconnecting from whatever it is that I'm stressed out about on a given day and putting my mind in a different world and letting it live there for a bit and not in the world I'm stressed about. And depending on the situation, what the particular thing I'm trying to disconnect from is, some books are better suited than others. Some tools are better suited than others. Sometimes you need scissors, sometimes you need a box cutter, sometimes you need tape, whatever. And one of the things that can be most challenging to disconnect from is kind of politics, the state of the world, um, you know, thinking about things like, gender and capitalism and history and all those sorts of things. Because when I'm stressed about that and I'm reading a book, my mind can still go back to those same places. I can be like, well, I'm reading this book, but like, okay, who wrote this book? You know, I mean, were they a man? Were they a woman? Were they white? What context were they writing in? What argument were they trying to make? How should I feel about that? How should I relate that to myself? Blah, 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 blah. And then I'm not disconnected and it isn't serving the purpose. At times like that, it is really handy to have a book around that wasn't written by anyone at all. A book like the one that I want to talk to you today, a book that is the subject of today's book report, The Iliad by Homer, translated by Emily Wilson. Now, as I said, you're skeptical. You do not think you want to read that book. And you've probably got a few questions at this point. In fact, there are 5 specific questions that I'm thinking you might have right now. Question number 1. What is the Iliad exactly? Like, I kind of remember something about it, but like, wait, what is it really? And then, as you think about it and maybe you do know a little bit more about the Iliad, your second question might be question 2. Wasn't the Iliad written by Homer? Like, I just said that this is a book written by no one, but here right on the cover is like, by Homer. Isn't that who wrote the Iliad? And along the same lines, if, to the extent that you know anything about the Iliad, you're probably thinking about question number 3, which is, isn't that a book you read, like, in school? That people read in school and in college or wherever? Like, that's not just a book you read for fun, right? And therefore, that leads to question number 4. Uh, why was Amy reading the Iliad? Like, Amy's not in school, right? Why was she just going out and reading that? Was just like for fun? What's that about? And thus leading us to question number 5, the important one, the one that I'm here to talk about today, which is, does Amy really think that I should go out and actually read the Iliad? And the answer to that 5th question is, of course, yes. That's the whole point of this. But I know it's going to be a hard sell. And to explain why the answer to that one is yes, I'm going to have to go through the other four questions first. So let's start with question number one. What is the Iliad exactly? So yeah, what is the Iliad? The Iliad, along with its sister poem, the Odyssey, is a poem, an epic poem, a book-length poem, written in ancient Greece, telling part of the story of the Trojan War. And let me be clear, when I say ancient Greece, I mean really ancient. Like, like when I say ancient Greece, you might be thinking of people like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, people like that. But the thing is, to those ancient Greeks, when they were alive and thinking of themselves as modern Greeks, like the most up-to-date Greeks, this was ancient Greece. And to those modern ancient Greeks, as far as they were aware, an ancient Greek named Homer, a poet, had written these two stories about the Trojan War. So what was the Trojan War? Well, the Trojan War was the last war of the Age of Heroes, the age when gods and men still walked together and fought together, and we've grown apart since then, but the climax of that age was the Trojan War, and the story of the Trojan War is basically that there was a Greek king named Menelaus, and he had a beautiful wife named Helen, and a prince from a city called Troy named Paris kidnapped Helen and took her off to Troy to be his wife. So Menelaus got all the other Greeks together, they formed a coalition, an army, and sailed off to Troy to attack it and sack the town and take Helen and bring her back home. It was a bloody war, a long war, it lasted 10 years, but ultimately they won, using the Trojan horse, which you may have heard about, where they sent a wooden horse into the city that had a bunch of Greek soldiers hidden inside it, and then they came out and slaughtered all the Trojans, and that's how they won. And that's the story of the Trojan War, in the very basic outline. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously. That's not the story of the Iliad. The Iliad is a story of one little part of the Trojan War, and it's kind of a weird part, to be honest. It's not the beginning of it, and it's not the end. It is towards the end, but before the Trojan horse. And the story of the Iliad is basically about an argument that breaks out on the Greek side. It's an argument between Achilles, who is the greatest fighter among the Greeks, and Agamemnon, who is the overall commander of the Greeks. And the argument is over which of them is going to get to keep a woman that they have kidnapped on one of their earlier raids. When Achilles loses this argument, he's like, well, screw you, I'm not even going to fight anymore. And he goes off and sulks in his tent. And as a result of that, the Trojans start winning the war. Without their best fighter, the Greeks are are losing. They're getting driven back, and it looks like the Trojans are about to overrun their whole camp and win the war. When it gets to this point, Achilles' best friend, Patroclus, puts on Achilles' armor and goes out to fight, as if he is Achilles, hoping to rally the troops and put fear into the Trojans. And it works for a bit, but then Patroclus is killed by Hector, the mightiest fighter on the Trojan side. When Achilles finds out that his best boy, Patroclus, has been killed, he loses his mind. And he's like, well, I am going to fight now. Puts his own armor back on, heads out there, and just starts destroying the Trojans left and right, drives them back, hunts down Hector, and kills him. And that's the story of the Iliad. It's kind of a weird story, right? Like, of all the tales of the Trojan War, why is it that that's the one that Homer chose to write about? And so that brings us to question number 2, which is, wasn't the Iliad written by Homer? So yeah, who actually wrote the Iliad? How did this story come to be written down in the first place? Well, when we shine the cold fluorescent light of history and science and archaeology and all of that on this book and the events in question, it seems that there really was a war that happened. that this is all based on. So, about 3,000 years ago, again, so long ago, a bunch of communities in what we would now call Greece got together and formed a coalition and sailed off, sent their best fighters off to fight against a city-state on the coast of what we would now call Turkey. And it was a long war and a bloody war, and they did win, but a lot of those fighters that were sent off never came back home to their communities. Um, and so, to make sense of that, to give some kind of meaning to the loss of the people that never came home, the only thing they could do was to tell the stories of that war and keep that memory alive. And so far that's a story that is not that unique. That has been happening over and over and over again everywhere in the world throughout human history, sadly enough. But there was something kind of special about this one, which was that it happened right before something that we don't fully understand, which is a period that's called the Late Bronze Age collapse, which is a time when, in this little part of the world in the Eastern Mediterranean, civilization just crumbled. Like, before this, at the time of the Trojan War, there were, reasonably large, communities that had, palaces and long distance trade and communications and all this sort of thing, and it just disappeared and went away, to the extent that even reading and writing disappeared. And so, for those who were still trying to keep alive the memories of those that had died just before this happened, they couldn't pass it down in written form because everybody had forgotten how to read and write. The only way they could do it was by telling the story orally, over campfires, generation to generation. They would be sitting around in the ruins of their former civilization, telling each other the story about how their forefathers, back in the heroic age, when they could still build these palaces that no one knows how to build anymore, when men were closer to gods, they had gone off and fought and died. And in the course of all those tellings and tellings and retellings, somehow, and we don't know how, two stories in particular, the Odyssey and the Iliad, they coalesced around each other, and they were the stories that everybody agreed these are these stories that everybody should know. So were they ever written by anyone? It's kind of a hard question to answer, and people have been debating it again as far back as we can look. But I actually think that we're better equipped now to answer that question than people were for a long time. Because really asking the question who wrote the Iliad is sort of like asking who wrote the pointing Spider-Man meme, right? Like, was it Stan Lee? Was it whoever directed that episode of Spider-Man the animated series? Was it the first person to use that image in a comment thread somewhere? Was it the first person to use that image in a comment thread somewhere that it then sparked and became viral? There's no answer to that question. And in kind of exactly the same way, there's no answer to the question of who wrote the Iliad. It just sort of happened. And it happened in such a way that by the time of those modern ancient Greeks, like Aristotle or whoever, it was just understood by everyone in the society that this was a story that you should know. That every well-educated Greek would be familiar with the story of the Iliad. And so that brings us to question number 3, which is, isn't the Iliad something you read in school? The answer to question 3 is yes. The Iliad really is something that you read in school. Like, again, as far back as we could tell, going back to the modern ancient Greeks, the Iliad was a story that was assigned reading, if you will. That it wasn't a story that you necessarily read for fun, per se, but it was a story that you read because it was a story that everyone in your society was supposed to have read. And this seems to be a thing that humans do. We organize ourselves around literary traditions, intellectual traditions that get passed down from generation to generation and are centered around a few core canonical texts and stories. And these can be like explicitly religious stories, like, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah. Or they can be not religious at all, like Shakespeare, for example, like Romeo and Juliet. We're kind of all supposed to know that story in our tradition. And they can run the whole gamut in that range. And there's different traditions, and none of them are particularly better than any other, So if you're in a Chinese intellectual literary tradition, you might be talking about the Analects, the Tao Te Ching, the Journey to the West, Mao's Little Red Book. I don't know. I mean, that's not my tradition, but in France, you might be expected to be familiar with Voltaire, and Moliere in a way that you're not here, and Russia's Dostoevsky, all that sort of thing. Um, but if for me, and probably for you, if you're watching this, if you speak English, you were probably raised in the tradition, the English-speaking tradition, or the Western tradition, as it might be called. Um, that is all constantly being updated, like up through, I don't know, The Great Gatsby, all the way back to whatever. But like the farthest back you can go in the tradition that I was raised in is the Iliad. That's the oldest story that, as far back as we can remember, as far back as we can look, every generation felt the need to tell their children this story. They felt it was important that this story not get lost. And so, yeah, for literally thousands of years, this story has been told, and it has been kept alive to the point where, yeah, even now, Emily Wilson is out there dedicating her life to keeping this story going. And I'm here as part of that project too. A project that dates back thousands of years of keeping the story of the Iliad, this one weird story from the Trojan War, alive. And so, like, why is that? Why is this story one that has survived for all this time? And that is the beginning of the answer to question number 4, which is, why is Amy reading the Iliad? How did I end up reading such a kind of surprising book for somebody to read outside of school? Because I wasn't assigned the Iliad in school. Most people aren't anymore. Which I think is, fine. I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. It used to be a lot more crucial to the curriculum. Maybe 100 years ago, anybody who had been to college would have been expected to have read the Iliad, but that's not the case anymore, and I never did. But I went through a phase, I've never fully exited, but particularly in the years like during and just after college, where I kind of was going out and searching for these classics, these canonical works of literature that I hadn't been assigned in school, or that I had been assigned but hadn't really read, Because I was struck by that question, like, why are these the classics? There must be a reason, right? And so I wanted to see what it would be like to read them, not because I had to, not because I was going to be writing a report about them, but just to try to get out of them whatever it was that people had gotten out of them originally that made them classics in the first place. And, to be clear, a lot of them did nothing for me, just like left me cold. Like, I don't know, the Brothers Karamazov, nothing. Like Thomas Hardy, all of it, could not care less. But some of them did. And one of the books that really did something for me during that phase was actually not the Iliad, but the Odyssey. And the Odyssey was recommended to me originally by my dad. And I don't talk about my dad as much as my mom, but, he also, of course, was a big part of my life and shaped me and my education and my learning. And he was telling me about how he had been assigned the Iliad and Odyssey in school, but he had read this translation in verse, in poetry, because these were originally written as poems. And when he had read that, it did nothing for him. He just couldn't get into it. But then later, he read a prose translation of the Odyssey, and it really clicked for him, and it really worked. And, his argument was like, yeah, that's how we consume stories these days, is in prose, not through poetry, as they did back then. And so, if we want to appreciate it, we should read it in the form that we appreciate things now. Um, and that's, really a crucial point, is that, especially about these works, is that the translation is really important. I think we kind of start out with the idea that translation is this sort of just mechanical thing of translating from one language to the other, but that's not true. Every translation is really an interpretation. There's no direct translation between one word in any language and a word in any other language. And all the more so when you're talking about something as distant as modern English and this ancient Greek. And so that was really interesting insight as well. And so I sought out a prose translation of the Odyssey. This one, the Dover Thrift edition by George Herbert Palmer. It was translated in like the 1890s, and gave it a shot, and I loved it. Um, why did I love it? Partly because it's a really, it's a good story. This story is about Odysseus, one of the fighters in the Trojan War, but it takes place after the war ends, and it's about his long journey to get home, to his home of Ithaca. And it's a well-structured story. It's got these parallel storylines going on. One of Odysseus trying to make his way home and all the adventures and crazy supernatural things, oh, hi, Rue, that he has to fight against on his way. And meanwhile, back at home, his wife and son trying to hold the fort against all the other, sort of chiefs and people on the island of Ithaca who are trying to move in and take over, and they want to marry his wife and take over his kingdom. And so that part of it is just it's a fun, exciting story in that way. But the thing that really got me is that it's a story about people that was written by people, that they're doing people things, right? Even though these are ancient Greeks, again, 3,000 years ago, living in a world that I can't even really imagine. And yet, when I read this book, I could feel this connection dating back over that whole distant time. And I'll read you a little section that is kind of the moment that really got me into it. And all this is Telemachus, Odysseus' son, going to bed. And walking by his side with blazing torch went faithful Eurycleia, daughter of Ops, Peisenor's son, whom once Laertes purchased with his substance when she was but a girl, and paid the price of 20 oxen. Her, equally with his faithful wife, he honored at the palace, but he never sought her bed, avoiding a wife's anger. Now she it was who bore the blazing torch beside Telemachus, for she, of all the handmaids, loved him most, and was his nurse when little. He opened the doors of the strong chamber, sat down upon the bed, pulled his soft tunic off, and laid it in the wise old woman's hands. Folding and smoothing out the tunic, she hung it on a peg beside the well-bored bedstead, then left the chamber, and by its silver ring pulled to the door, drawing the bolt home by its strap. So there Telemachus, all the night long wrapped in a fleece of wool, pondered in mind the course Athena counseled. And yeah, that was 3,000 years ago, but still somebody going to bed, taking their clothes off, and lying up, thinking about the problems that they're faced with. That was kind of the moment that got me into Homer in general. And that is the beginning of the answer to the most important question that I've been trying to get to. Question number 5. Does Amy really think that I am actually going to read the Iliad? Because, yes, again, the idea of this whole series is to convince you to read this specific book, the Iliad, translated by Emily Wilson. And to this point, it sort of sounds like I've just been giving an argument for why you should read the Odyssey, translated by George Palmer. And as far as that goes, you should. I like it. It's a double book report. I'd give this 4 stars. Good book. I recommend it. But to answer why the Iliad by Emily Wilson is the real subject of this book report, I'm going to kind of like pull in threads from all the things we've talked about so far to finally get to the thrilling climax here. So first off, again, talking about the tradition that this is part of. Because when I felt that connection to the ancient Greeks, there was more, it was deeper than that. There was more to it than that. I was feeling a connection to everybody that has read this story throughout these past thousands of years. It's not just that I was reading this book. It's that everybody I've ever read has read this book, more or less, like including John Keats, who I'm like secretly kind of fond of, even though he's the English romantic poet that even other English romantic poets were like, you are a lot, buddy. But he wrote, and this I was assigned in school, a sonnet called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. And I'll just read about his experience of reading Homer for the first time in an English translation. And just reading the end of it, when he says, "Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien." And I felt that too. I felt that connection with Keats. And so, that's part of what's great about reading the Iliad, is connecting with all those people over time. Another one, again, talking about translation, like realizing that's, why I'm talking about this Iliad and not any other. And to give you, again, another taste of that, I'm going to read you just one sentence from a couple different prose translations of the Odyssey. First, from the George Palmer one that I already read. This is the sentence right before what I read originally. It says, "But Telemachus himself, where on the beautiful court his chamber was built high upon commanding ground, went to his bed with many doubts in mind." Now here's that same sentence from a translation. I've got it on my phone. It's public domain, so I got it off Project Gutenberg. Translated by Samuel Butler at around the same time. I think about 9 years later than this one, actually. But Butler translates that same sentence as, "Telemachus's room was high up in a tower that looked on to the outer court. Hither then he hied, brooding and full of thought." So you see, what a big difference there is, right? Butler, is translating it in this very, kind of high, kind of intentionally archaic, even at the time, tone, whereas Barbara is a lot, sort of more smooth and natural. So, I had read other translations, including that one, and I knew that I liked this one the best. But that meant that I knew that there might be others that I liked even more. And so I was keeping my eye out for those, in a not in an active way, but just a little bit. And then in, I believe, 2018, Emily Wilson came out with her translation of The Odyssey. And it got great reviews, and I was struck by a couple things. One, it was the first ever full-length English translation of The Odyssey that had been made by a woman. And another one was that this is actually a poetry translation, a verse translation. But she made the choice to translate it into iambic pentameter, which is the language of Shakespeare. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. If music be the food of love, play on. Things like that. And that made a lot of sense to me because, iambic pentameter, is language of Shakespeare. It's something that sort of just is natural in the English language. And it is also, the original Iliad and Odyssey, like Shakespeare, those words were not written to be read off the page. They were written to be spoken aloud. And I knew from like my experience of reading Shakespeare in high school that sometimes I would be trying to read it not making any sense, but when I would speak it, it would come alive. And so I was hoping to get the same experience. And I read this translation. It was, pretty good. And I'll read you that same sentence in this translation, which is, Telemachus's bedroom had been built above the courtyard, so it had a view. He went upstairs, preoccupied by thought. In the next sentence, a loyal slave went with him, Eurycleia, daughter of Ops. She brought the burning torches. So you can hear how it kind of has that rhythm. And you can also hear another key thing, which is related to it being, a woman translating it, I have to say, which is that Eurycleia is described as a slave. Not as a handmaiden or a wise old woman, but as a slave because that's what she was. And so, I thought that was really cool and interesting. And I read it. And like I say, I liked it. But, honestly, I don't know that I liked it better than my previous favorite translation. Because the first thing was still kind of, it held me back. And I was like, I think I'm going to stick with the one I liked originally. And so then, a few years after that, she comes out with her Iliad. And I was very skeptical. Because the fact is, I didn't like the Iliad that much. I did read the same translation by the same guy of the Iliad, and I liked it fine, but much less than the Odyssey. I found it very repetitive. It's just like, this guy killed that guy, and then that guy's friend got mad and tried to kill the other guy, and then they got into a fight over his corpse, and then this god was like, hey, what's up? And it's just a bunch of fighting and killing and fighting and killing. It felt very repetitive. And so, even though this translation got reviewed just as well as the Odyssey had, even really more so, I was like a little bit skeptical. It's why I have the paperback version, not the hardback, because it took me a while I was like, I'll give it a shot. And then it sat on my bookshelf for a while. And then I eventually read it, and oh my god, you guys, I loved it so much. Um, there's a few reasons why it stands out even more than all these others that I've talked about. One of them, and you can get this from the introduction, her amazing introduction, which is by itself worth the price of admission, is that this is the one she loves. She loved this poem more than the Odyssey in the original Greek. Which, again, to be clear, I'm never going to learn Greek and read them in the original. I am reliant on translations. But she does read it in the original, and she thought the Iliad was better. And she also, didn't put herself in this limitation that she had with the Odyssey of doing it not just in verse, but in the exact same number of lines. This one, she gave herself a little more freedom, and I think that paid off. But also, she really gets across something that I hadn't realized, a different way of looking at the story, which is that, yeah, there's a lot of war and slaughter in this book, but this book is not about the killing. It's about the dying. And it's about the people who are left behind. And it becomes really powerful that way. And I'll just read you the last paragraph of her, again, incredible introduction. It just says, you already know the story. You will die. Everyone you love will also die. You will lose them forever. You will be sad and angry. You will weep. You will bargain. You will make demands. You will beg. You will pray. It will make no difference. Nothing you can do will bring them back. You know this. Your knowing changes nothing. This poem will make you understand this unfathomable truth again and again, as if for the very first time. And it does. It really does. But not just that. I read this book reading it out loud to myself, and I absolutely, when you read this, do the same. Find places where you can be alone and read it out loud, hear it, let you feel the rhythm and the music of it. Because it is a page turner. I was absolutely just into it, reading it from beginning to end, not wanting to stop. Like, I'll just, the first few lines of the poem. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain, and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades, and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. And it just goes on and on like that, and you can like take any random page, like this page here. Shame on you, Greeks! It is a certainty that we must either die or find salvation by pushing this disaster from our ships. If Hector in his shining helmet captures our ships, do you think any one of us will come home safely to our native land? Do you not hear how Hector stirs his army? How eagerly he yearns to burn our fleet? He is not calling them to dance, but fight! There is no better option for us now than combat, with our hands and hearts engaged. Better to live or die in one quick fight than slowly suffocate in long contention, squeezed by a lesser foe as we are now beside our ships. So you get it. That's just, I could literally flip to any page and you're drawn into it. And I'll just close with little excerpts from one of the best scenes in the whole book. This is Hector, the mightiest fighter of Troy, talking to his wife Andromache. He's about to leave and go back to battle. And Andromache says to him, "What are you doing, Hector? You strange man, your will to fight will kill you. Do you feel no pity for your little baby son? Or my unhappiness, my life of loss? Soon I shall be your widow. Soon the Greeks, all of them rushing at you all at once, will kill you. Then for me, when I have lost you, better that I sink down below the earth. There can be no more comfort afterwards for me when you are dead, but only pain." And he says, "My spirit tells me I must not stop, for I have learned always to be a warrior and fight among the frontline champions of Troy, to win great glory for the king, my father, and for myself. You see, my heart and mind know this for sure, that there will be a day when holy Troy will be destroyed, and Priam, lord of the Ashwood spear, and all our people, but no one matters more to me than you. No pain that anyone in Troy will suffer, not even Hecuba or High King Priam, not even all of my many noble brothers who will be slaughtered by our enemies and fall amid the dust in days to come. No pain of theirs affects me more than yours. One day, some bronze-armed Greek will capture you, and you will weep, deprived of all your freedom. And sometimes people will see you weeping there, and they will say, 'That woman used to be the wife of Hector, who was the greatest champion of Troy during the Trojan War.' But as for me, I hope I will be dead and lying underneath a pile of earth so that I do not have to hear your screams or watch when they are dragging you away." And it's just, yeah, it's just wonderful. And I hope that that sounds wonderful to you, and maybe it does or maybe it doesn't, but I think that's the best argument I can make. I spent long enough making it. Anyway, that is my book report of the Iliad, translated by Emily Wilson. I give it 5 stars. I highly recommend it. I hope you do too. Bye.